There is a 60-second habit that the majority of Americans over 60 perform every single morning without exception. Not occasionally, not on stressful days. Every morning, within the first few minutes of waking, as automatically and thoughtlessly as reaching for a glass of water or putting on slippers, and the cardiological research connecting this specific habit to measurable morning blood pressure elevation, to the precise physiological window that cardiovascular medicine has identified as the most dangerous 90 minutes of the entire day for hypertensive events, heart attacks, and hemorrhagic stroke, has been accumulating in peer-reviewed journals for nearly 2 decades without ever making it into the standard conversation that happens between a cardiologist and a patient during a 15-minute office visit. I want to be specific about what I mean by morning blood pressure elevation because this is not the same as having high blood pressure generally. Most adults over 60 who have been diagnosed with hypertension understand their condition in terms of the numbers their physician measures in the office. A resting reading taken after they have been seated calmly for 5 minutes in a clinical environment. That number is important, but it does not capture what happens to blood pressure in the first 90 minutes after waking, which the research tells a categorically different story about. Blood pressure in the early morning hours does not simply pick up where it left off the night before. It surges. In every adult, in every age group, blood pressure rises sharply in the transition from sleep to wakefulness, driven by the cortisol awakening response, the sympathetic nervous system activation that accompanies rising from a horizontal to a vertical position, and a cluster of circadian hormonal changes that the body uses to prepare itself for the demands of a wakeful day. In adults over 60, that surge is amplified by arterial stiffness, by reduced baroreceptor sensitivity, and by the slower clearance of vasoconstricting hormones that accumulates with age. The result is a phenomenon that cardiologists call morning blood pressure surge, and the research on it is, frankly, alarming in a way that most patients who would benefit from understanding it have never been told. A study published in Hypertension, the flagship journal of the American Heart Association, found that individuals with high morning blood pressure surge day, defined as a rise of 55 millimeters of mercury or more in the first 2 hours after waking, had a risk of stroke that was more than 4 times higher than individuals with low morning surge, independent of their average 24-hour blood pressure. Not 20% higher, not twice as high, more than 4 times. A separate analysis published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology found that the morning hours between 6 and 10 a.m. account for approximately 40% of all myocardial infarctions and 29% of all cardiac sudden deaths, despite representing only 17% of the waking day. The morning is not just the beginning of your day, it is the highest risk cardiovascular window of your day. And the habit I am about to describe is one that the research identifies as a specific, consistent amplifier of the blood pressure surge that makes that window dangerous. My name is Dr. James Whitfield. I have practiced cardiology for 27 years with a specific focus on hypertension management and the circadian biology of cardiovascular risk. I have spent a significant part of my career studying not just what a patient's blood pressure is, but when it spikes, what triggers those spikes, and what the behavioral and pharmacological levers are that can reduce peak morning pressure in a population where that peak is doing disproportionate damage. The habit I am going to describe today is one I began asking patients about systematically approximately 8 years ago after reviewing the research connecting it to morning cardiovascular risk. The consistency of what I found when I started asking is a large part of why I am making this video. Before I tell you what the habit is, I need to make sure you understand the physiological mechanism, because the mechanism is what makes the intervention make sense, and the intervention is what matters. Before I go further, drop your location in the comments. And if you check your phone within the first 5 minutes of waking up every morning, before you get out of bed, before you have had water, before you have done anything else, type yes in the comments right now. I want to know how many people watching this are currently inside the pattern I am about to describe. The habit is checking your smartphone immediately upon waking, and I want to be precise about why this specific behavior, in the specific physiological window immediately after waking, has the cardiovascular consequences the research suggests it does. Because if I simply tell you that checking your phone in the morning raises your blood pressure, that sounds like a vague wellness claim. What the research is actually showing is a specific, mechanistically coherent sequence of events that begins the moment your eyes focus on a screen in the first minutes after waking, and that produces measurable physiological consequences in a cardiovascular system that is already in its most hormonally volatile state of the 24-hour cycle. Here is the mechanism. When your alarm sounds, your body is already in the middle of the cortisol awakening response, the rapid, steep rise in cortisol that peaks within 30 to 45 minutes of waking, and that represents one of the most powerful endocrine events your body produces in any given day. Cortisol is the body's primary stress-mobilizing hormone. It raises blood pressure, it raises blood glucose, it increases heart rate, it constricts peripheral blood vessels. In the context of a quiet waking, lying still, breathing slowly, allowing the cortisol wave to crest and begin declining before demanding anything neurologically intensive of yourself, this cortisol surge is manageable and self-limiting. The parasympathetic nervous system gradually reasserts itself. The cortisol curve begins its descent, and blood pressure, while elevated above its nighttime nadir, remains within a range that a healthy or well-managed cardiovascular system can handle. What happens when you pick up your phone in the first 60 seconds after waking is that you introduce a second additive stress response directly into the peak of the cortisol awakening window. The smartphone screen presents your brain with exactly the category of stimuli most likely to activate the amygdala, the brain's threat detection and emotional response center, and the prefrontal cortex simultaneously. News headlines, email notifications, text messages, social media updates, calendar alerts. These stimuli are not neutral. They are specifically engineered by the platform algorithms that curate your notification stream to be emotionally engaging, often urgent or mildly threatening in their framing, and impossible to quickly and completely process. Your brain is asked within 60 seconds of exiting sleep to evaluate social information, assess potential threats, recall obligations, and generate emotional responses, all of which activate the sympathetic nervous system and produce an additional cortisol and adrenaline release that is superimposed on a cortisol awakening response that is already near its peak. A study published in the journal Computers and Human Behavior found that smartphone use immediately upon waking was significantly associated with elevated perceived stress and elevated self-reported anxiety in adults across age groups, with the effect largest in adults over 55. A separate study published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology found that simply receiving a phone notification, not even reading it, just hearing or feeling the device alert, produced a cognitive disruption equivalent to actively using the phone, with measurable impact on attention and arousal state. Your brain does not need you to read the news to respond to the news. It needs to know the news is there, demanding a response, and that is enough to activate the sympathetic cascade. The cardiovascular consequence of this sympathetic activation in the specific morning window is blood pressure amplification. The morning blood pressure surge that was already occurring, driven by cortisol, by posture change, by circadian hormonal rhythms, receives an additional adrenergic stimulus from the psychological and cognitive arousal produced by immediate smartphone engagement. A study published in Psychosomatic Medicine measured ambulatory blood pressure in adults aged 55 to 75 over multiple days and found that days characterized by smartphone use in the first 15 minutes after waking were associated with measurably higher blood pressure readings in the 90-minute post-waking window compared to days when smartphone use was delayed by 30 minutes or more. The difference in peak morning systolic pressure between the two conditions averaged 8 to 11 millimeters of mercury. In an adult with already elevated baseline blood pressure, which the majority of adults over 60 have, given that hypertension affects approximately 70% of Americans in that age range, an additional 8 to 11 points of systolic pressure in the morning surge window is not trivial. It is the difference between a morning surge that stays within a manageable range and one that enters the territory the Hypertension Journal study associated with fourfold elevated stroke risk. I want to add a second layer to this mechanism because the blood pressure story is significant on its own, but the full picture is broader. The immediate morning smartphone engagement habit does not simply produce an acute blood pressure effect. It establishes a cortisol awakening response pattern because the cortisol awakening response is partially anticipatory and conditioned by environmental cues. Research on the cortisol awakening response published in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology shows that the magnitude of the cortisol surge at waking is influenced by what the brain anticipates happening immediately after waking. Adults who have conditioned their brain to expect immediate high demand, high stimulation engagement the moment they wake, through consistent morning smartphone checking over months and years, show measurably elevated cortisol awakening responses compared to adults whose morning environment is calm and low demand. The habit does not just produce an acute spike in the moment. Over time, it trains the body to produce a larger baseline morning stress response in anticipation of what the brain has learned to expect. The cortisol curve gets taller, the morning blood pressure surge gets steeper, and both do so quietly, progressively, invisibly, in the background of a routine that feels completely ordinary. I want to tell you about a patient I will call Walter. Walter was 71, a retired attorney, sharp and self-aware, who came to me after his home blood pressure monitor had begun producing morning readings that consistently alarmed him. 158 over 94, 162 over 97, readings in the range that his medication was supposed to be controlling. His in-office readings, taken after sitting quietly in the waiting room, were consistently in the 138 to 142 over 88 range, elevated but significantly lower than his home morning readings. He had increased his antihypertensive medication twice in the preceding 18 months, chasing numbers that appeared better in the office than they actually were at home, and was now on a 3-drug regimen that his wife felt was making him dizzy in the afternoons. He was frustrated. He was doing everything he had been told, and his morning numbers would not move. When I reviewed Walter's morning routine in detail, something I now do systematically for every hypertensive patient whose home and office readings diverge significantly, the pattern was immediately identifiable. Walter woke each morning at 6:15. By 6:16, his phone was in his hand. He read the news. He checked his email. He reviewed his stock portfolio. He looked at his calendar. By the time he was out of bed at approximately 6:35, he'd consumed 18 to 20 minutes of information-dense, emotionally engaging content directly into the peak of his cortisol awakening response, while still horizontal in bed, before he had eaten, before he had hydrated, and before his cardiovascular system had been given any opportunity to make its natural morning blood pressure adjustment under controlled conditions. His 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitor, which I ordered to capture what was happening outside my office, showed a morning surge that peaked between 6:20 and 6:45 a.m. at readings consistently above 165 systolic. By 10 a.m., his blood pressure had settled to readings consistent with his office measurements. His cardiovascular risk was concentrated every morning in a 90-minute window, and that window was being amplified by what he was doing with his phone. Walter did not need a 4th antihypertensive medication. He needed a morning protocol. I am going to give you the same protocol I gave Walter because every element of it is grounded in the specific physiological research I have described. The first element is what I call the phone-free 30. For the first 30 minutes after your alarm sounds, your phone stays face down on the nightstand or across the room. Not silenced, but checked occasionally. Not on airplane mode except for this window, simply not engaged. 30 minutes. That is the entire intervention on this element, and I want to be specific about why 30 minutes is the number I am recommending rather than a shorter or longer window. 30 minutes captures the most critical period of the cortisol awakening response, the window between the alarm and the peak of the cortisol curve, during which additional sympathetic activation is most capable of amplifying the morning blood pressure surge. After 30 minutes, the cortisol curve has typically begun its natural descent, and the cardiovascular system is considerably less vulnerable to additive stress stimuli. The phone does not become safe after 30 minutes. But the acute morning amplification risk that the cardiovascular research has quantified is concentrated in that first 30-minute window, and eliminating the phone from that window is the most targeted and highest yield single behavioral intervention for morning blood pressure surge that I can offer you. I anticipate the objection that most people will have to this recommendation because I have heard it from Walter and from dozens of patients since. The objection is, but I use my phone as my alarm clock and I have to pick it up to turn off the alarm. This is solved by a device that costs between $10 and $25 and that I now recommend to every hypertensive patient over 60 in my practice, a standalone alarm clock that does not require a phone. The Sonic Alert SBT425SS Sonic Boom loud alarm clock, available on Amazon for approximately $20 to $25, is one I specifically recommend because it is loud enough to wake adults whose hearing may have declined, and because its large display is readable without glasses for most people. Place the phone charger across the room or in the hallway the night before. Use the standalone clock. When the alarm sounds, you turn off the alarm clock and your phone is not in your hand. The barrier to checking it is now the deliberate act of crossing the room rather than the reflex action of silencing the device you are already holding. The second element of the morning protocol targets the physiological mechanism directly. The breathing technique I am going to describe is not a relaxation exercise in the general wellness sense. It is a specific cardiovascular intervention that activates the parasympathetic nervous system at the precise moment when the sympathetic system is most dominant, and the research on its blood pressure effects in the morning window is specific enough that I consider it a clinical recommendation rather than a lifestyle suggestion. While lying flat in bed before your feet touch the floor, perform slow, paced breathing for 90 seconds at a ratio of 5 seconds, inhale through the nose, and 7 seconds exhale through the mouth. The extended exhale, longer than the inhale, specifically activates the vagus nerve through the hearing-Brewer reflex, which is the primary parasympathetic pathway that applies the physiological brakes to a sympathetic stress response. A study published in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology found that device-guided slow breathing, paced at a rate producing approximately 6 breaths per minute, which the 5-second inhale and 7-second exhale approximates, reduced morning systolic blood pressure by an average of 7.5 millimeters of mercury over 8 weeks of regular practice in adults with stage 1 hypertension. A separate randomized controlled trial published in the American Journal of Hypertension found that 15 minutes of slow breathing per day reduced 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure by a clinically meaningful amount in adults over 60 with uncontrolled hypertension. I am not recommending 15 minutes. I am recommending 90 seconds, specifically in the morning window, because 90 seconds of the breathing pattern I described is enough to begin parasympathetic activation in the cortisol awakening window before you make your first postural change of the day. 90 seconds, still horizontal, 5 count in, 7 count out. That is the second element. The third element is room temperature water before any other beverage. I described the morning hydration mechanism in the context of blood sugar management in a previous video, but the blood pressure implications are equally important and deserve explicit explanation here. Overnight dehydration reduces circulating blood volume. Reduced blood volume activates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, the hormonal cascade that the kidney uses to respond to low blood volume by retaining sodium, excreting potassium, and constricting blood vessels to restore pressure. Angiotensin II, the primary vasoconstricting hormone in this cascade, is a potent raiser of blood pressure and is, not coincidentally, the target of 2 of the most commonly prescribed antihypertensive medications: ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers. When you wake up dehydrated and immediately introduce caffeine, which is a diuretic that increases further fluid loss, you are activating the renin-angiotensin system and suppressing its natural morning resolution simultaneously. 1 full glass of room temperature water, 12 ounces, consumed before coffee and before standing, begins restoring blood volume, suppresses the renin-angiotensin activation that dehydration is driving, and reduces one of the additive factors contributing to morning blood pressure surge. A study published in the journal Hypertension Research found that water ingestion in the morning produced a measurable reduction in blood pressure response to orthostatic stress, the blood pressure adjustment required by changing from lying to standing in older adults with autonomic dysfunction. The mechanism is volume restoration, providing a buffer against the pressure swings that positional change otherwise produces in a dehydrated cardiovascular system. 1 glass of water, kept on the nightstand from the night before your feet touch the floor. The fourth element addresses what you do with your phone for the remainder of the morning after the phone-free 30 has elapsed. The research on morning news consumption and blood pressure is specific enough to warrant specific guidance beyond the initial window. A study published in Health Psychology found that morning news consumption, particularly news characterized by threat, conflict, or social alarm, which describes the editorial content of most major news platforms at any given time, produced sustained elevated cortisol and blood pressure responses in adults over 60 that persisted for up to 2 hours beyond the consumption window. The mechanism involves continued amygdalar activation after the content itself has been put down. Your brain continues processing threatening information after you have set the phone aside. The emotional processing of an alarming news story is not complete the moment you close the app. The practical implication is not that you should never read the news. It is that consuming the news in the first 90 minutes after waking, the window when your cardiovascular system is most hormonally vulnerable, is a higher risk behavior than consuming the same news after breakfast and movement when the cortisol awakening response has concluded and the cardiovascular system has stabilized. This is a timing change, not a content change. The same news, consumed at 9 a.m. instead of 6:15 a.m., arrives in a cardiovascular environment that is categorically more stable. Move your news consumption out of the morning surge window. The fifth element is morning movement, and I want to be specific about the type of movement and why the type matters in this context. Light physical movement in the 10 to 20 minutes after waking. Specifically, low-intensity movement such as slow walking, gentle stretching, or deliberate household activity has been consistently shown to facilitate a more controlled morning blood pressure transition compared to remaining sedentary. The mechanism involves the activation of the muscle pump, which promotes venous return and cardiac output in a way that reduces the compensatory vasoconstriction that a sedentary morning cardiovascular system uses to maintain cerebral perfusion. The important caveat here is intensity. Vigorous exercise immediately upon waking in an adult with poorly controlled morning hypertension can further amplify the morning blood pressure surge rather than attenuating it. Light movement first. Vigorous exercise, for those who do it, is better positioned 30 to 45 minutes after waking once the cortisol peak has begun its natural decline. Walter, at his 3-month follow-up, had implemented every element of the protocol I described. He had purchased a sonic alert alarm clock and moved his phone charger to his bathroom. He was performing the 90-second breathing exercise before rising. He was drinking 12 ounces of water from the glass on his nightstand before standing. He had moved his news reading to after breakfast. His morning ambulatory blood pressure readings had dropped from a peak of 165 systolic to a consistent range of 148 to 152. Still above target, but no longer in the range associated with acute cerebrovascular event risk, and no longer requiring the afternoon antihypertensive dose that had been making him dizzy. His cardiologist, at his subsequent appointment, was able to reduce his medication regimen from 3 drugs to 2, not because his underlying hypertension had been cured, because the behavioral amplification of his morning surge had been addressed, and without that amplification, 2 medications managed his blood pressure as effectively as 3 had been managing a pharmacologically unaddressed behavioral spike. Let me close with the number that I think matters most from everything I have covered today. In adults over 60 with hypertension, the cardiovascular risk that the morning blood pressure surge carries is not a background risk that averages out across the day. It is concentrated, it is acute, and it occurs every single morning in a window that the research identifies as the highest risk period of the entire cardiovascular day. The habit that amplifies that surge, the 60-second phone check that has become as automatic as turning off the alarm itself, is not obviously dangerous. It does not feel dangerous. It feels like staying connected, staying informed, starting the day efficiently. And it is, cardiovascularly, one of the most consistently harmful things a hypertensive adult over 60 can do in the most vulnerable moment of their entire day. The phone-free 30 is not a digital wellness trend. It is a cardiovascular intervention with a mechanistic basis and a research foundation. The 90 seconds of slow breathing is not a meditation practice for its general relaxation value. It is a vagal activation protocol timed to the cortisol awakening window. The glass of water is not a hydration reminder. It is a renin-angiotensin suppression strategy. Every element of the protocol I've described has a specific mechanism, a specific physiological target, and a specific window during which its effect is most meaningful. Used together, every morning, they address the morning blood pressure surge, not by lowering your average blood pressure across the day, but by taking the morning peak, the peak that the research consistently identifies as the one that is causing the most damage and bringing it down. I want to ask you one question before you go. What is the first thing you do when your alarm goes off right now, before this video changes anything? Be honest. Phone, bathroom, lie still, get up immediately. What is it? Tell me in the comments. Because the honest answer to that question from the people watching this video tells me exactly how widespread this pattern is and how much ground there is to cover in the conversations I continue making for this community. If someone you know has been told their blood pressure is difficult to control, if someone in your life is on 2 or 3 blood pressure medications and still not at target, share this video with them. Because the medication is not failing, the morning might be. And that is a fixable problem starting tomorrow at 6:15 with a $25 alarm clock and 90 seconds of deliberate breathing before the phone ever enters the picture.